Growing up where and how I did, the start of the NES era was an especially exciting time. Up until that point, the only options I had on the home market had been stuff like the Odyssey II, and Television, and Atari 2600, systems I quite frankly didn't care much for. When Nintendo's new entertainment system burst onto the scene, for the very first time I was greeted with graphics and sound that actually looked similar to the arcade games I had known and loved for years. Better still, many NES games began adding deeper gameplay mechanics, expanded content, and introducing genres that simply hadn't existed in the arcade the same way. The system is a big piece of gaming's history, and has some of the best games ever made as part of its library. Let's take a look at my favorite games for it. When I was a kid, Mike Tyson had quickly become a mythical figure of the boxing world. The man was unbeatable, a titan that could knock out the best boxers in the world in mere seconds. Nintendo harnessed the power of that narrative, and in late 1987, they released Mike Tyson's Punch Out, a port of their popular arcade game of the same name. Perhaps just as important as Tyson himself, you get a list of colorful characters here, each with their own look, style, and special attacks that need to be countered. The thing is, you are Little Mac, an ordinary guy who is short on stature but big on heart, and it's gonna take a lot of punches to make your way to Kid Dynamite himself. My friends and I loved it from the first time we hit the start button. It was challenging, its fights had an almost puzzle-type reasoning to them, and it looked and sounded great for a game released in 1987. It's a classic that remains almost infinitely replayable today. When Contra dropped in early 1988 for the NES, it was a strong lesson in how a home port didn't necessarily need to equal the arcade version in visuals to be a better game. Konami took the basic design of the arcade, kept the two-player mode, and then gave it its own unique sound, and expanded the level design into a very different feeling game. The result is one of the most playable run-and-guns of the 8-bit era. It also was one of the first times a cheat code was so prominently known by its fans, not just because the game was challenging, but also because it was just so damn catchy. It certainly wasn't the first game of its type, but it was definitely one of the best playing and sounding. It set a standard by which all similar games after would be judged, and it remains some of Konami's finest work. One of the really nice things about the NES was how much of its library began to evolve over time. It started out with simple arcade ports, moving on to games that had expanded play mechanics, to games that started mixing up genres. One of the best examples of that was 1989's DuckTales. Part action platformer and part adventure game, you take control of Scrooge McDuck and his bid to find hidden treasure all over the planet and beyond. You can take on any of the game's opening levels in any order you want, and there are things you need to find that are hidden away in them that can only be accessed at certain times. This means a bit of exploration and the possibilities of different endings. Capcom made some great games for the NES, and this one here was one of their best. American football games were a hard sell for me back in the third generation of machines. The experience was so stripped back it just wasn't the same, and I often avoided these kinds of games because they were not much fun to play. That was until Tecmo showed up with Tecmo Bowl, a home take on their arcade game of the same name. The gameplay was ultra simple, relying on only a handful of plays to choose from on offense and defense. While it did have an NFL's Player Association license for real athletes, it lacked the names of the teams themselves and only had 12 of the available 28. All that sounds terrible on paper, but there was something special here about its fast gameplay and easy to pick up mechanics. The better athletes in the game could do crazy over-the-top actions that gave the game a charm and appeal. Bo Jackson could run circles around you, Joe Montana could throw 100-yard bombs, and Lawrence Taylor could swim past the best defenses for easy sacks. It was more a video game than a simulation of the actual sport, and it was all the better for it. Ninja Gaiden was a game that introduced me to the power of cinematics. It wasn't an RPG or an adventure game. It didn't need them, but the power and effectiveness of them in telling a story was truly unique at the time, particularly in this kind of game. It was released in the US in 1989 and was immediately the talk of my school. Ninjas had been crazy popular then, and the katana-based gameplay was bolstered by special weapons you could pick up during each stage. It also was a game that was exceptionally easy during its first half, luring you into a false sense of security, and the second half of the game smashes you over the head. The challenge ramps up to the point that will test every ounce of your patience and skill. The thing is, you still can't help but love the thing. It looks great, has some of the most memorable music on the platform, and is truly a great playing game. Third-party software was always as important to Nintendo's success back then as their own stuff, and the NES experience wouldn't have been the same without this easy-to-pick-up-and-play treasure. I've told you guys countless times that I was not an RPG or an adventure guy in my youth. I didn't care for them and found most of them really boring. Yet something drew me into The Legend of Zelda in 1987. Perhaps it was the way the game just threw me into the action without killing me with 20 minutes worth of dialogue, or some muddled story I didn't care about. Perhaps it was the great overworld music that drove me on to see the next screen. Or maybe it was all the hidden content to find that just pushed me to see what else I could discover. Whatever it was, Zelda was a truly special game for me. It couldn't have been more different than the stuff I was used to playing at that point. 1987 had given birth to a great many NES titles, and few of them were anything similar to this. The thrill of discovery was the main strength of this experience, a free-flowing adventure that allowed you to explore at your own pace, where and when you wanted. It would take years for other games to come along and match its appeal, and the many nights I spent lost in its magical world were some of my best. The Super Mario games were major reasons why the NES was so popular. They were simple but great playing games that had an appeal that could snag young and older gamers alike. Among these was 1988's Super Mario Bros. 2 that hooked me the most. I had enjoyed the brick breaking and turtle smashing of the first NES Super Mario, but this was something else entirely. Here you could pick enemies up and throw them. You could pick up vegetables and hurl them at your foes. You could blow things up with bombs, use keys to open doors, and find all kinds of hidden nooks and crannies for shortcuts, warp zones, and different routes to take. You could dig through sand, fly on the backs of enemies, and even access alternate dimensions for power-ups and coins. You also had a choice of 4 very different characters, each with their own feel and strengths. While you had to love the stage and world designs in Super Mario Bros. 3, I couldn't help but feel like the gameplay took a big step back from this. I couldn't do half the stuff in that game I could do here, and I found myself coming back to it because of that. It wasn't originally a Mario title in the first place, but I think that was much of its appeal. It broke the mold that would dominate those games for years, and I loved every minute of it. Sunsoft made many a special game for Nintendo's 8-bit platform, but it was 1990's Batman the video game that is perhaps their strongest entry. It uses the Tim Burton film as an outline for its setting and characters, and includes content from the comics as well. It was some of the best graphics on the platform, particularly when it comes to the finer details of the NPCs and environment. Even more impressive than its visuals is the killer soundtrack. The guy that did this was also responsible for a ton of classic tunes, ranging from Blaster Master all the way up to Albert Odyssey on the Sega Saturn. Gameplay is even deeper than the great Genesis version, giving you the ability to wall jump and having the choice of 3 different weapons to use that can be switched on the fly. The end result was a title that looked among the best, sounded among the best, and played among the best of any available game at the time. The challenge topped off an effort that easily earns it its place on this list. If there is one constant on my channel besides my love of Sega, it's my admiration for the Castlevania games. The first 2 entries for the NES had an appeal all their own, but it was 1990's Castlevania III Dracula's Curse that takes the crown that generation. Multiple paths, multiple characters, and some of the finest music ever to grace a cartridge made this an unforgettable experience. Not a whole hell of a lot has changed between this and the first when it comes to gameplay. You still whip enemies into submission, and you still have sub-weapons to aid you in combat. The real power of this one comes in the different choices of routes you can take, some more difficult than others, and the ability to gain companions that have radically different powers and abilities from the main character. You also get different endings based on the choices you make, giving the game even more replay value. It was released in 1990, and even with a Sega Genesis hooked up to my TV, I still had to play it. It was simply that damn good. Being a kid of limited means meant that most of my NES journey was based on borrowing games from my friends and picking up the odd game from bargain bins. Rygar was one of the very few games I would receive for the system, a 1987 platforming adventure title that I thought for sure was going to suck to high heaven. To my surprise, it didn't, and it would endear itself to me as one of the NES's most unique games. First is the presentation itself. It's a mix of side-scrolling and overhead stages that give way to different areas and bosses that must be explored and defeated. In these areas are also items you must find to give your hero the tools he needs to traverse the land more efficiently. There is also a system of gaining levels to increase your life and attack powers, as well as healing yourself. It's a fairly good-looking game overall, and I adore its weird music. I also felt the NES was at its best when a game mixed up ideas from different genres and gameplay types, which was something you simply didn't see a ton of back then. Rygar nailed it, and I'll never forget the car ride home after my parents bought it for me. Sealed games didn't come home with me often, but I sure am glad this one did. For about 3 years, the NES was the center of my video game world. 1986 to 1989 saw a steady flow of quality software that rejuvenated the US video game console market after the vicious crash that relegated the hobby to near obscurity a few years prior. While Nintendo used some dubious tactics to keep the competition at bay back then, you simply cannot argue with the sheer volume of memorable titles for the platform. It started so many franchises that would dominate for years to come, and brought a success to the industry that would assure its longevity. 34 million units would be sold in the US alone, and I was happy to call myself an owner of one. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.